Good evening and welcome to The Core, coming to you live from Channels Television Studios in Abuja, Nigeria. I am Kadria Ahmed.
In recent times, I would say that the xenophobic attacks on foreign nationals has quite increased and also has taken a different dimension in the sense that in recent times, the manner in which the attacks are being carried out, they seem to be pre-planned before every attack these days. For example, weeks before each attack, you see social media, you see, voice notes making around on the social media, you see messages on social media, rightly highlighting the areas they will attack and why they want to attack those areas. So roughly a week plus, the president visits South Africa. Why Nigerians are still reeling on the aftermath of the recent xenophobic violence. Another xenophobic attack took place in a province called Malanga, to be exact, in a place called Witbank CBD. You see? And Nigerian shops and businesses were targeted by natives, by locals, who came with quantum buses. They planned it, they pre-planned it. They came there, they broke into the shops, looted them, beat people up, and all of that. And set 2 shops alight. Many Nigerians sustained severe degrees of injury. Some of them were hospitalized. Luckily, none of them died.
That was Dr. Stanley Uba, the Secretary General of the Nigerian Citizens Association South Africa, speaking on the recent attacks against Nigerians and other Africans living in that country. The xenophobic attacks by black South Africans against other Africans are not new. In 2008, the world woke up to the gory pictures of Mozambican immigrant Alberto Hamuve, who was set on fire during one of those horrific attacks. He didn't make it. He died. 11 years on, black South Africans are still taking out their rage on their fellow Africans, destroying and looting businesses belonging to African citizens living in South Africa, maiming and even killing some of them in the process. The government of South Africa seems to have no answer to these hate-fueled crimes. Indeed, it has been alleged that there is tacit endorsement of these attacks by some people in government who appear to blame immigrants for all the woes facing the country. For example, a 2017 video making the rounds appears to show Bongani Mukungi, the Deputy Minister of Police, the agency charged with maintaining law and order in South Africa, at a press conference accusing foreigners of economic sabotage. But if the South African government is unwilling to take the necessary tough measures to curb these crimes, what about the governments of the immigrants getting attacked? Indeed, what, if any, is Nigeria's policy regarding the welfare of its citizens living abroad? This and more in today's edition of The Core. But first, a more detailed look at the issues.
On the 2nd of September 2019, foreigners, including Nigerians living in Johannesburg, Pretoria, and surrounding areas, were attacked by South Africans. These attacks date back to 1994. According to the African Center for Migration and Society, Gauteng province has witnessed the highest number of attacks between 1994 and 2019. These attacks have been recorded in other areas like Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, Eastern Cape, Mpumalanga, Northwest, Free State, and Northern Cape. The death of Mrs. Elizabeth Ndubisi-Chukwu, a Deputy Director General of the Chartered Insurance Institute of Nigeria, who was allegedly killed in her hotel room while attending a conference in South Africa, caused a reaction from the Senate. However, this did not stop the trend of xenophobic attacks. Wale Harmony, a Nigerian, runs a restaurant in the Malvern area of Johannesburg. He suffered losses after one of such attacks.
The situation is very bad. You can see the whole shop everywhere. They have already burned it in their loot.
The attacks have led to injuries and deaths. The African Center for Migration and Society has been monitoring these attacks since 1994. Its XenoWatch tracker collates data of reported attacks. According to the report, 529 xenophobic incidents were recorded between 1994 and December 2018. This has resulted in 309 deaths, 901 physical assaults, 2,193 shops looted, and over 100,000 people displaced. In the data for 2019, that is between January and September, 68 incidents were recorded and 18 people were killed. Almost 1,500 people were displaced and over 147 shops were looted.
Every day, we're all Africa. Why must we be afraid to go to South Africa? Which South Africa has ever been better in Zambia? Which one?
The wave of attacks sparked reactions across Africa, especially Nigeria, with protests at the South African High Commission by the National Association of Nigerian Students. The federal government took a hard stand, insisting that enough is enough. The South African High Commissioner to Nigeria was summoned to explain what has been happening.
What we are witnessing, or what is unfolding now in South Africa, are sporadic acts of violence, are sporadic acts of criminality. These are individuals who are taking advantage of the situation that we find ourselves in, and we condemn that. So, Moyo, these are not, to the best of our knowledge, acts of xenophobia.
While the government called for caution against the retaliations, Nigeria pulled out of the World Economic Forum hosted in Cape Town, South Africa. Both nations exchanged visits from special envoys to resolve the issue.
A short while ago, with His Excellency President Buhari, the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, to convey our President Ramaphosa's sincerest apologies about the incidents that have recently transpired in South Africa. Those incidents do not represent what we stand for as a constitutional democracy in South Africa, and the President has apologized for these incidents.
Nigerians who wanted to return home were given the opportunity to leave South Africa. In a bid to ensure that there is no repeat of the attacks, President Muhammadu Buhari led a delegation to meet the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa. The meeting appeared to have yielded results as an action plan was agreed upon.
We welcome the willingness of the government of Nigeria to work with us to address these challenges. During our talks, we reviewed a range of issues of bilateral and continental and global interest to both countries.
Nevertheless, there are still pockets of xenophobic attacks in the Rainbow Nation. Hopefully, the action plan designed at the last meeting between both presidents can come handy this time.
Joining me in the studio today to discuss some of these issues is the Executive Chairman and CEO of Nigerians in Diaspora Commission, Mrs. Abike Dabu. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening. Mr. Folusho Phillips is the Chairman of the Nigeria-South Africa Chamber of Commerce. Sir, thank you. I know you rushed into the studio from a late flight in Lagos. I appreciate you making the effort. Thank you so much. Ambassador Humphrey Ojiako also joins us. He was Nigeria's former permanent representative to the United Nations Relations. Thank you, sir, for coming.
Thank you so much.
And finally, Dr. Oke Ikechukwu, a leadership and governance consultant and also public communications expert. Thank you, sir, for coming.
Thank you.
We, of course, also, as usual, have a studio audience. They will be part of this conversation. Now, at this point, it is important that I mention that we did invite the South African Embassy to take part in this program, and they politely declined our invitation. Let me start with you, Mrs. Dabiri. We heard in that video reports of some of the issues that not just Nigerians, but other African citizens in South Africa are facing. But we also heard the South African government making a concerted effort to insist that these are not xenophobic attacks and these are just crimes. What is your view and that of the government regarding the nature of these crimes?
Well, that interview was before the president's visit to South Africa. Again, good evening, everyone. Was before the president's visit to South Africa. And one thing is, at least South Africa has admitted that there is a problem with xenophobia. And with the president's visit to South Africa, which I think was a very, very good move by the president to show maturity, to show leadership. And then in the words of the president, if they show hatred, you show love. Love overcomes hate.
Many people were actually of the view that he should not have gone on that trip. Let me explain why. Let me say what people are saying. They felt that if he'd cancelled that trip, it would have sent a very strong message that Nigeria cares about her people and will not tolerate any violence against them.
But let me tell you the message he said, because he met with Nigerians in South Africa. They said, Mr. President, thank you for restoring our dignity. And then the president of South Africa said, thank you, Mr. President, for showing maturity and leadership. You know, and that particular visit in particular, you know, after that event, we know we had 1 or 2 cases which
exactly.
Which are not, you see, we have to understand the fact that in South Africa, there are about 50 crime cases in a day, 20,000, about 20,000 in a month. So it's a country with a high rate of crime. So you need to separate xenophobia from crime, which is prominent in South Africa. So one thing is, number one, the South African government at least admitted that we have a problem of xenophobia. Before, they were denying it. 2, they are making a concrete attempt to actually, in fairness to them, do something about it. Now, these 2 cases, the early warning signal is working, because as soon as it was about to happen... And
I want us to get into sort of what the tangibles were that came out of that visit. But let me bring in Mr. Phillips here, because he heads the Chamber of Commerce that brings South African and Nigerian business people together. From the perspective of business, how do you view these problems?
I think that, in fact, I always look at the whole situation like a pyramid and divide it into 3 levels. And the greatest level, the lowest level in the pyramid is that where we've got problems of a very, very economically challenged South Africa, taking out their frustration on anybody that's nearby. When you begin to move higher up this hierarchy, you find out the relationship is totally different. We have hundreds of doctors and nurses and accountants and a lot of people that are working professionally and are highly respected and highly welcomed in South Africa. But it's literally the man on the street at the very, very bottom of the pyramid that's totally frustrated.
But isn't that the man that
system.
needs the protection more, the most vulnerable in society?
Well, that's a problem that South Africa faces in terms of the, call it the challenge of the government in its inability to deal with these things. And they recognize it. And without giving them any excuses, the fact is, when you're dealing with the people that are hungry, they're tired, they're frustrated, and they're saying that they can't see this wonderful South Africa that was promised to them by Mandela, you know, 27 years after, they're taking out on anybody that's nearby.
Yeah. I mean, Ambassador Humphrey, cynics, not me, but cynics, listening to what Mr. Phillips is saying would say, this sounds like a very sort of elitist conversation where people who are sort of able to make money in their relationship with South Africa are kind of perfectly happy for things to carry on because the violence is not really affecting them, but affecting the poorest of the poor. What are your thoughts regarding these attacks that we keep seeing again and again?
Thank you, Kadara. Indeed, I think that even elite opinions matter because at the end of the day, it concerns everybody. Even elites lose their relatives in these attacks also. So one way or the other, they are also affected. So everyone is affected. One thing I would like to address immediately is this use of the word xenophobia. xenophobia in South Africa, why is it mostly sub-Saharan Africans, people of sub-Saharan African extraction, black people, black Africans, that are almost always the victims of these attacks?
What is your theory?
Is it xenophobia then, or is it just
economic challenges,
taking out their frustrations, as he said, on the nearest people they see on the ladder of competition? That is the people who trade in the open shops and places like that, and who compete with them.
Okay,
really.
so we're now trying to sort of understand the crime itself. What are your thoughts, Dr. Ikechukwu, regarding the crime itself that is being committed and the reasons for it?
I think, first of all, we make a distinction between the failure of the South African state to maintain law and order at all levels and the challenge of economic survival that's forcing those on the lower rungs of the ladder to take out their need for survival on the nearest possible victim. I will submit that it is xenophobia. You also have to do a psychological disaggregation of the various blacks in South Africa. People from sub-Saharan Africa, particularly those who are Nigerians and around Nigeria, are temperamentally different from the average South African. Our profile is fairly obvious. If you see 10 blacks walking in South Africa, you can pick out the Nigerian. His footsteps are stronger, etc. And then you look at the lower level of the economic environment. They are the dominant players. Most of their services are provided by them. Commerce is driven by them. And then the state, seeing that kind of a volume of activity and doesn't do what it needs to do in terms of security, and knowing that it's within the economic net that has no safety platforms, the steps that should be taken are not taken, so their vulnerability is much higher. And you go down, you know, there are places in Johannesburg. You have the place called Lagos, you have Balogu, you have all those places, and most of them are abandoned neighborhoods. You have a place as big as Maitama that was vacated, and some of the buildings there are 21 stories. And people living there living illegally, etc.
Okay, so, I mean, he's touched on a few issues, Mr. Phillips. I want to bring you back in here. I was in South Africa at the time of the attacks in September. And we had a plenary session that addressed just the attacks. And South African black men told me that this is a legacy of apartheid, and it has a lot to do with self-hate, because black men were taught to hate themselves and their identity was stripped from them. And so even now when they're in trouble, they find it very difficult to fully look at either white people or Indians or coloreds as being responsible. They take it out on, if you like, themselves, and so we look like them. I mean, in the conversations that you are having as business people trying to sort of grow the South African economy, is consideration being taken into the fact that the people committing these crimes might also be victims, and policies being put in place to tackle this?
Very, very much so. And you know, that's what I'm trying to say, that you see, if you've grown up or you've been raised in an environment in which you've never really had an opportunity to actualize yourself, and then you wake up one morning and you can, and yet you don't know how to. And then you have other Africans who've really been free, so to speak. They come into your environment and they're doing things that you would love to do, and you just can't. And it's a great source of frustration to a lot of them. Now, in terms of dealing with it, the first thing is to try and say, I remember many years ago, this is to my early trip to South Africa, I met a Nigerian chap, I think an Igbo chap, running a barber shop, literally on the streets, with a generator, and, you know, and the South African brothers, so to speak, were actually expressing frustration against him. And he said, all you need to do is to ask me to teach you, and I'll show you how you can do the same thing. Why don't you go and buy your own little generator and start barbing here like I'm doing, rather than criticizing me for doing it? So that frustration is there, that inability to actually do things is something that's really pestered them. They've moved gradually over time, and what the government should do is to really try and find a way in which it can continue to take the people from what is really poverty to a higher level of actualization. And I think that a lot of Africans there can help them if they have the right attitude.
We are going to take a quick break. Don't go away. Welcome back. You are watching The Core, and we are discussing the xenophobic attacks against Nigerians and other African citizens in South Africa, as well as policies that are designed to protect Nigerians abroad. Now, you can join the conversation on our social media handles, Twitter at Channels TV or at Kadria Ahmed, YouTube at Channels Web, using the hashtag NGTheCore. You can also follow us on Facebook at Channels Forum. Mrs. Dabiri, you heard that very robust response from Mr. Oshomole following the attacks in September. You went to South Africa, you came back, and from the point of view of those of us watching, it didn't seem as if the engagement was as robust as Mr. Oshomole would have wanted it, and a whole lot of other Nigerians as well. So can I start by asking you, what intangible ways did you come back with, specifically to do with protecting Nigerians in South Africa against violence?
Well, it was very robust, it was deep, and it was very successful. First was an elevated Nigeria Binational Commission, Nigeria-South Africa Binational Commission, which had been abandoned for years. And the elevation meant, number one, the early warning signal mechanism is now in place. And what it means is that before anything happens, somebody reports and the police gets involved. Before, one of the problems was that the South African police looks away. And that's why we had the Minister of Police Affairs on that delegation. And the last incident that happened...
Wasn't it his deputy we saw on tape blaming foreigners for...
No, I'm telling you what happened after. So I'm telling you now that South Africa police and government have realized that they have to take that responsibility. Now, the attack that happened, not too long ago,
October.
Immediately there was a response by the police, and immediately an action was taken. Immediately the early warning signal mechanism was put in place. So the discussion was robust, it was deep, and the key thing is Nigerians in South Africa, in fact, Africans in South Africa must be protected. Now, this particular case, the police stepped immediately and an arrest was made, and no death was recorded. And then secondly...
Hang on. Part of the problem is that the police that are supposed to be protecting people are not trusted by a lot of the African citizens, including Nigerians in South Africa. Let me finish.
That the police are now part of the... No, you are asking
it's less
for
than a week.
takeaways.
I'm going to ask you for a specific incident. Less than a week ago, the South African police was accused of attacking immigrants who were protesting outside the UN office and attacking them and wounding them. The same South African police that you say have reassured you that they are going to do...
I'm talking as it relates to Nigerians now and what we came back
Nigerians
with.
were among those people that were attacked.
Well, that is not to my knowledge yet. But what I'm telling you is that if the police do not do their job, then we have to go back to what we agreed. And the Nigerian government will have to intervene once more time. They've agreed with us that they will protect immigrants, and they have to protect immigrants. So far, don't expect that there will be no crime in South Africa because we had
No, we're talking specifically about xenophobic attacks.
The last one that affected in Nigeria was a case of a lover, some man and his girlfriend and a woman. That was the incident that happened. So the case of the UN is another matter entirely, but I'm telling you what we came back with, and we're going to insist on that. Now, at the level of the two ministers of foreign affairs, they take up the discussions. And don't forget that, just like Mr. Felicia Phillips has said, there has to be socio-cultural engagements. The guy doing that is doing it out of ignorance, and we all have to help them if they are willing to accept that help. And one of the things that we're doing is we're even saying that we're ready to give you that education. And they're willing. In December, there'll be some team to engage community to community at the communal level between Nigeria and South Africa, in fact, other African countries and South Africa. So we need to help that average South African who doesn't seem to understand to do something about it. It's also a problem for the government of South Africa, and they're trying to deal with it. So at that level, we need to engage with them on the streets.
Let me bring in Dr. Ikechukwu. Are you satisfied that the level of response of the Nigerian government to these issues is sufficient and robust enough to lead to a lasting difference?
Not exactly. For one thing, I can't put my finger on what the response is. For another, we need a single narrative, but if you listen to from Oshomole's submission, on what platform is he speaking? He's a chairman of a political party, just happens to be the party in power. Will all other chairmen take their positions? And the suggestions he is making, well, you think that we are still in the era of barbarism, where if you annoyed me, I kill all the chicken in your house. It's a global 21st century village where any action you take has reverberations. There are agreements signed by Nigeria with other African countries. So after listening to him, you shudder. And he's not reprimanded. He makes the job of people like Mrs. Kadiri here, Dabiri here very difficult. This is civilization, and the approach is not reassuring. Now, on the matter of the actual impact, I will, for instance, look at the repatriation of Nigerians. If you recall, it was a private airline that decided to go and bring back some young Nigerians. The other issue, and that's where perhaps there's some slack for the government, is that if you look at the profile of most of those brought back, by their own capacity as human capital, they functioned on the fringe of legality.
Okay, before we get into that issue, I'd like to ask the ambassador, because he's an experienced diplomat, whether in his views what we are doing is adequate in terms of, trying to solve this problem, and if we're being fair to our citizens in South Africa that are getting attacked.
Thank you. This issue of xenophobic attacks in South Africa just dovetails into the general consular problems that many Africans, Nigerians especially, experience and encounter in various countries where they are operating. So to begin to deal with it in the high-handed manner that Mr. Oshomole was proposing simply could exacerbate things, make a bad situation worse.
But isn't it quite frustrating? Because, people sitting back see Nigerians being treated, and seemingly government not either willing or able to defend them.
On both sides, consular matters of this nature are usually very delicate matters. If you mishandle it on one stage, the consequences on the other country, the victim country, could even be worse. So, yes, the Nigerian government could do more, a lot more. For instance, as he alluded, for a private person, a private company, to be taking responsibility to bring Nigerians home or to give them succor, provide them succor in the country of their residence, that is not his call. That is the call of government. We can understand the financial constraints and the resource constraints that government is experiencing, but that cannot be an excuse when the life of Nigerians are concerned in consular matters. So it is a good thing government has established a commission now for diaspora matters. We are hoping that that commission will be properly funded. So the natural excuse we always have is perennial excuse, no funds, no funds. So if that is overcome, maybe we could begin to make some traction.
No, but there are still no funds, but we'll get by. We'll get by, hopefully. But what was I going to say now? The issue of air peace. When President Buhari gave instruction for Nigerians to be evacuated, Air Peace chairman immediately said, Mr. President, I want to do it. I mean, that was a great gesture for him. You don't expect us to say, don't do it. So he immediately made that offer, and we were glad he did, and he brought them in. So government is not saying they can't do it, but it was a great offer from Air Peace, and we were glad to receive them. And when they came back, we received them very warmly, and we ensured that, they got the warm welcome.
Okay,
and
now,
again,
policy,
when you say,
let me talk
just
to you
a minute, he said something about the kind of people that returned. We saw them firsthand. They varied. There were people whose businesses, they were living legally, but their businesses were destroyed. They didn't want to stay there anymore. Yes, there were those who didn't have their papers who came back, but there were genuine businessmen who came back because there was no reason to stay there anymore. There was a widow with her 4 children. She's lost her husband. What is she still doing there? And she came back home. And I tell you, we're monitoring them, and we continue to monitor them and ensure that, they do very well.
Beyond what's happening in South Africa, and now that you have a whole commission for diaspora affairs, what is, if there is, what is the policy regarding looking out for Nigerian citizens that are abroad? Because the stories are plentiful, whether it is in India, whether it is Ukraine, whether it is Turkey. Every day you hear 1 or 2 cases about Nigerians being badly treated and not being able to access any help, from the embassies, from the high commissions. So what is sort of now the policy regarding these sort of issues?
Well, I agree that there are sometimes challenges with the missions and all that, but it's beginning to change. Where we have issues with Nigerians in the diaspora, the commission comes to do whatever we can. The case of India in particular, there's been an agreement with the Indian authorities that we get those Nigerians stranded in India back, and we're working at that. You know, we've had some signing of agreements, and the case of India we hope will be resolved. But at the same time, we tell our citizens, don't go to any country to commit crime. When you go to India, for instance, you go as a student, you get there, you refuse to come back. They're going to detain you. You go to India, you're not going to get a job. So don't bother to say you're going to study and don't come back. So the stranded ones were working. They're in a detention center. India, they have their processes. We're working at getting them back. And we'll do that as soon as possible.
Isn't this really, though, part of the problem? Because when we listen to government officials like yourself, it's almost as if you're justifying attacks against Nigerians by suggesting that they are criminals.
No, what I'm telling you,
and yet we know.
I need to take that back. No. What I'm telling you is that
please be clear.
There are two sides. Listen, you go to India, okay? You go as a student, but you get there, you refuse to come back after your so-called study, and then you get into trouble. You can't work, you can't do anything, you start doing drugs. Then you get into trouble, and then you overstay your visa. They have their rules, we have our rules. And then they take it seriously, and then they detain you. What we need to do is come into attention.
But I'm not necessarily talking about Nigerians abroad committing crimes. I'm talking about Nigerians who are legitimately in countries like some of the ones.
No, give me concrete examples.
Our colleague, Aisha
Falode, yes,
her son died in Dubai.
Her son died in Dubai. Ask Aisha how we intervened, even in Parliament.
He was thrown.
There was no commission. No. Don't get too deep into Aisha's story because we all know what happened.
Okay.
Yeah, so, was thrown, and the guy who did the thing was a Saudi guy that was, but it was more than that. I don't want to go into that. I personally intervened in Aisha's case. And for the commission, as any case comes, we deal with them. We don't have to come to the media. We deal with them. As they come, we treat each case on its own merit, and we've solved several. We have our challenges. We don't have funding, and I hope we get funding in the 2020 budget. But it's not about funding. It's about just even responding to some of these, cases. So there are some cases we've solved, and we hope to do much more with the missions and the commission and Nigeria diaspora organizations.
Okay, I can tell you there are people that are not convinced that you're doing
enough.
Let
them talk to us. Let them talk to us.
Let me bring in members of the audience. Sasa, let me just bring in members of the audience. Comments, questions? Yes, the gentleman in blue. Tell us who you are and keep it short, please.
Okay, my name is Oluwafemi Adeyemo from Yali RSC. My question is that the narrative people are giving around Nigerians in diaspora has always been that of crime, drugs, and corruption. And even Nigerian government have not been able to give a concrete message out to the international community that Nigerians are legitimate citizens studying abroad, living abroad, and they are law-abiding. So what is the message that the Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs is passing to the international community to make sure that Nigerians and their human dignity is not being abused anymore? So I don't know, maybe you can help us address that one.
Let's take a few, and then we'll come back to you. It's so much easier. Let's take a few comments.
Yes, absolutely. You can have this.
Hello. Yes,
okay, thank you very much. My name is Bushra Balogun. I'm here as a girl child advocate and advocate for women in politics.
Yeah.
So my question goes to Madam Abikedabe. Fine, I must commend you because I would say you've been doing a lot, like citing the case of the lady that had a drug issue and you were able to help, and thankfully we got her back. Okay. So the thing, I think for me with our policy, I would say Nigerian foreign policy seems to be in a state of comatose because I think it's not really strong enough. We have policies and we think, okay, so these policies are supposed to really protect our interests, but in the real issues we see most Nigerians really face issues and they're not really protected, so to say. I think we need to consult more on multilateral issues and build consensus that's germane to our own Nigerian interests, because we seem to play this big brother role most times. We think, okay, things happen like in Nigeria. I'm speaking in Nigerian context now. We play a lot of big brother role and a lot of things happen. But at the end of the day, these people I don't think they really value a lot of things we did to them. And it shows that really, we're not really doing much. I think you have to really tell us, convince us to make understand that Nigerian policies actually protect the right of Nigerians and it's not
Thank you very much. Yes, anybody else? Okay, let's come back to you. The question that was raised really is like, we seem to be big brother. In the case of South Africa, for example, part of the anger among Nigerians is the role we played in the fight against apartheid, and the fact that South Africa seems to be, well, they feel South Africans are being ungrateful, and that it's time to start looking inwards and looking after our interests before we play big brother. That was the second question. And then the gentleman on the right.
When we had issues with Ghana, Togo, we went the ambassadors. I said something to them. I said, if Nigeria closes her borders for 1 week, you'll understand, you're going to feel it. And it has happened. So let's take it that things are beginning to happen. In terms of dignity, just today, we have the second Nigeria Diaspora Investment Summit. Come as Nigerians in diaspora coming home to invest in their country, doing great things. So we have a program called Diaspora Delight. On my phone, I have 1,000 Nigerians that I've excelled in the last 2 months. So let the media join us in celebrating them. The bad news travels fast. The good news just is behind. So for us, we will keep talking about the good news that, okay, even in South Africa, ask Dr. Phillips, we were all there. You'll be shocked at the number of Nigerians excelling in South Africa, doctors and everything. So we'll continue to do that. In terms of policy, we have a foreign affairs policy, a foreign policy, which is the domain of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm sure they continue to strengthen it. But for us as the Commission, wherever any Nigerian in diaspora has a problem, and not always problems. They are here now to talk about investment. We're attending to them. When there are problems, we attend to them.
Okay,
It's going to be gradual, but we're working at it.
Let me bring in Dr. Felicia Phillips here. Sorry, sir. I'm getting a bit of a cold as well, so I'm trying to save my voice. What is the likely impact of these things that are going on this proposed Africa free trade zone, in your view?
Well, I don't think there are two sides to this story. And if you look at the concept of Nigeria shutting itself from the rest of Africa, what it begins to do is, like Dabri just said, begins to show the strength of the country from the point of view of the size of the market that we have. But one thing is sure, and it has been, and it isn't affected us even in the likes of South Africa, our inability to be a very productive nation. If you look at let's stick to South Africa. If you look at the balance of payments that we have, South Africa we've got a positive balance of payments in South Africa simply because we ship crude oil. If you look at what South Africa exports to us, it's greater value to them. I always say that a liter of wine from South Africa engages a greater percentage of the South African population than a liter of crude oil. And that is the story of Nigeria. So sometimes we find that with the free trade zone that's coming on board, we've got to ask ourselves, what kind of contributions are we going to be able to make, as opposed to just being a country that all the other countries can come and put, or I won't use the word dump, but just place their own products in our country because of our inability to, first of all, satisfy our own internal needs, let alone begin to export to other parts of Africa.
Isn't that really also, Ambassador, part of the problem why we've also seen an increase in actually immigration numbers, especially among our most vulnerable and the poorest, because our economy isn't doing as well as it should?
In fact, that was the main thing to be addressed on the part of the Nigerian government. The question was raised, what government should do to begin to bring down the level of xenophobic attacks, the level of irregular migration from here to other places. It is the economy. Today, we have to feel really sorry sometimes for the young people growing up, passing through school, leaving school, and are simply looking for jobs that do not exist. And that's the majority of young people. So they take the chances. They take their chances. If you throw open our borders today, say those who wish to leave, probably will need an army to stop the deluge of people trying to pour out of Nigeria. First, they don't know that some of these places, they're going to have similar difficulties as we have in Nigeria, problems of unemployment and so on. But there's something he said I would like to address immediately, and there's something the young lady said about this Father Christmas foreign policy or something like that. We should be careful. I've said that in so many places. We should be careful what we mean by these things, Nigeria playing Father Christmas. take a look at any basic central market along the west coast of Africa, from Senegal to Togo to Benin Republic. You find out in some of these markets, the lingua franca is Igbo or Yoruba or something. If those people should, okay, say, we have been pushed to the wall. These Nigerians, all of you live here, and that happens in one go. What do you think the consequences will be for the Nigerian government? Can we handle that? So we have to be careful and measure these things when we say them. The other thing is that, like they say in America, is the economy stupid. If we get it right here...
Okay. I'm going to have to ask you to just pause a little. We will come back to you after this little break. Don't go away. Welcome back. Now, that was the very articulate MP Julius Malema of South Africa talking in his, very direct style about the way he sees this problem. He raised an issue that we'd started talking about briefly before, which is that of self-hate and the fact that black South Africans, he feels, in attacking other Africans, are in many ways perpetuating what was done to them by white people. And so as we enter this last section, I'd like to talk about solutions. In real terms, what can be done so that this problem can be solved? Because obviously South Africa, second largest economy in Africa, Nigeria, first economy in Africa. If we are to grow Africa to Africa trade, these two countries must do well, must be able to work together. If we start with you, Ambassador.
In fact, the key to the solution of these problems, both irregular migration from Nigeria and the consequences that exist outside on the part of Nigerians, is the economy. We have to do well economically. If Nigeria's economy is doing well, and I can say, I'm not in government anymore, so I can speak my mind. Some say agriculture is doing well, and because of that, we now have to stop importation of certain other goods from places, especially where they're doing exportation of, you import rice from some other country, it comes into your country and you bring it into Nigeria. That's wrong. Those things are against the trade. But we have signed AFTA, and we have also signed ECOWAS. These are bridges to economic growth and development. If Nigeria becomes an industrial country today, and I think that is the objective, both of this government and past governments, to grow Nigeria into an industrial producer, like we were saying, what do we have to sell in the market? Assuming tomorrow we break through and achieve the capacity to produce things to sell in the market, who is our natural market? Is it not Benin, Togo, and so on, ECOWAS market, the aftermarket? So if we stop that through these short-term measures of closing borders, alienating our neighbors who have been, they are also suffering, they are hurting. Okay. So Nigeria's role as a major player in the continent is to show the kind of leadership, according to Mrs. Dabiri, Mr. President showed when this xenophobic thing broke out.
Does that sound about right to you, Dr.
Some modifications. The real issue is the need to resuscitate local economies. Boko Haram has driven people out of their place of residence for more than 3-4 years in some parts of the north. In those places, re-desertification has taken place. Even if you move everybody there, they will be on ration for 3 years. Now in China and some other countries, they have a technology that can enable you farm the desert within a month if you take the trouble. Now if that happens, all the people who are running around will have things to do. Sugarcane, less comes in. Dates, less comes in. All the farmers. And then Baldamin has also kind of wiped out the economies that follow the Niger all the way from the north to the south. Rechannelization is possible to bring in more water. So I think that if we focus too much on distributive trade, which is actually the focus of all this talk about rice and all sorts of importation, we forget that this will be a rational approach to economic development. It will never work. It will never make people active across all the 36 states. But if steps are taken that will enable people and they live in the way they used to do, before oil, before all of those things. Then you're talking about actually capacitating and deploying human capital where they reside. Then you're talking about possible and sustainable development of these youth that are running out of the country.
Let me bring in the businessman, so to speak. Part of the confusion for amateurs like me, when we listen to people like the ambassador, the doctor, and even people like you, is that we are torn between being told that, well, if you look at different countries, at some point, they've all had to use some sort of protectionism in order to sort of grow their local industries. And that if Nigeria had done that, maybe our shoe industry that was on the up might not have collapsed, and all of that and all of that. And then we go and sign a trade agreement, right, that says, you know, free movement of goods and labor. And then we close our borders. And it's all really confusing for people like me. So, and then you hear that and you hear him. So, I mean, what do we do?
A member of our chamber once used a term, and this is when we went to South Africa. He talked about opportunity and means. And at that time, he was trying to refer to the fact that Nigeria had huge opportunities and South Africa had the means to give meaning to those opportunities. You've always got to accept, and I said earlier on, that we are not a very productive nation and we've got a lot to learn. You see, you only get good at swimming when you practice every day. We have not been practicing. We're out of practice. We've been rather, I won't use the word lazy, but we've been spoilt. And as a nation, we need to do a lot of work to get our productive capacity up. Now, it's unfortunate that we're going to have to work with partners to make it possible. All the engineering and all the heavy metal work that we need to do in this nation, we're going to have to do it in conjunction with others who have been doing it before. Maybe South Africa, China, America, wherever it is. So the first thing that we've got to learn to open ourselves up to the Western world, to build up the capacity to be able to respond to the fact that our economy's got to grow, our young ones have got to be employed, and we've got to produce more than enough to ship out to the rest of the world so as to help our balance of payments. So the fact is, we've got to go through the process. There's no shortcut. Now, the whole essence of you talk about this opening up our borders. Well, for some people, for some countries, for some time, some presidents, they are very tactical about it. And sometimes you can afford to be a bit selfish and tactical and say, no, I will not allow this to come in because I need to grow my own local capacity. The thing about it is that we closed our borders and they said, okay, are we producing enough rice? Because, you know, there's a lead time. Yes, we need to produce our own rice so that we're self-sufficient, but the fact is it takes a few years for you to get these things done. So we need time, and during that period, we still got to eat, we still got to grow, we still got to respond to what's happening in the system. So it's got to be a managed process, but it's got to be one that the government is thinking about very carefully. We're balancing it. We don't really shut the door, but we sort of control the door a little bit.
And Mrs. Dabiri?
Well, we're practicing. I'm practicing well and taking the right steps. And like you said, there are some tough decisions that need to be taken. The advantages outweigh the disadvantages on the long run. It's not, we can't go too deep into that conversation, but what we need to do is explain more why it's being done. I mean, that you open your borders doesn't mean you will allow you to bring in substandard goods, arms and ammunition and all that. Come on, we need to do some things ourselves. So I think we are practicing and we're practicing well. Now we have the leadership that says some things have to be done. And back to the diaspora, what we're saying is that we know we have the good, the bad, and the ugly, but we have more of the good. If one Nigeria commits a crime, 10,000 are doing great things. Okay. We will celebrate ourselves and tell the world that that is who we are, hardworking, brilliant, intelligent, developing world economies.
I've got about 2 minutes to close the program, and I'd like to sort of go back to exactly where we started on the issue of sort of just protecting the rights of Nigerians, not just in South Africa, but in other parts of the world. So from the point of view of what happened in South Africa and what we see in other countries, outside government, is there a role for business, for civil society, for diplomacy? And if I go this way again, and we end quickly, 30 seconds each, please, because I have to close the program.
In fact, I think government that is responsible for diplomacy should take the higher end of doing something to protect citizens anywhere they are in the world. There was a time when the foreign ministry started what they called citizen diplomacy, I think that was the idea. That was the key. And it should be funded. That is why I still think that the Diaspora Commission is a good idea. It need not be a perpetual idea, but for now, that Nigerians are being victims of these things everywhere.
Doctor?
It's important.
Well, I think that, yes, I mean, in the matter of civil society, the bulk of Nigerian civil society need to educate itself or re-educate itself on the concept of national interest, communication in the interest of the nation, citizenship, education, and the rest of it, so that you find that there needs to be a consensus. The crisis we have, I think, from the angle of civil society is that the funding comes from donor agencies who want a particular kind of report, and there's therefore a preponderance of civil society activists who speak to a non-Nigerian audience while thinking they're addressing Nigerian
Role of
issues.
business,
You've got to decide if you want to do business or not.
Okay.
Well, the Commission will work with everybody, business, private sector, civil society, to achieve that aim of protecting Nigerians wherever they are.
Thank you very much. We have run out of time. Thank you to my panelists and to those who came to the studio to also take part in the conversation, and those of you who joined us watching from home. Please join us for the next edition of The Core on the 4th of December 2019. On behalf of Channels Television and Daria Media, I'm Kadria Ahmed, wishing you a very good evening.